I'd like to introduce Brandon Daniels. Mr. Daniels is the Chief Executive Officer of Exiger, a global leader in supply chain risk management, transparency, and compliance. With decades of experience in regulatory compliance and technology, Mr. Daniels has led efforts to help governments and private industry strengthen the security and integrity of critical supply chains, including those in pharmaceuticals, defense, and healthcare. At Exiger, he has overseen the development of innovative tools that identify vulnerabilities, improve visibility, and help ensure that products and medicines reaching American consumers are safe, reliable, and free from hidden risk. Mr. Daniels, thank you for being here, and I look forward to your testimony.
Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Gillibrand, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. For 20 years, I have worked with pharmaceutical and medical device companies, supporting them through some of the most significant crisis management and litigation matters affecting their product development, research, and supply chains. During the COVID-19 pandemic, I served on the White House's Joint Acquisition Task Force, where I worked alongside federal partners to secure PPE, medical devices, and life-saving pharmaceuticals. That experience underscored for me the fragility of our pharmaceutical supply chains and the urgent need for reform. In my role at Exiger, I'm leading the development of artificial intelligence to map supply chains down to their raw material origins. This work reveals in precise detail the vulnerabilities hidden in our healthcare system. The scope of this problem is enormous. America's medicine cabinet is no longer made in America. Nearly 3/4 of the essential medicines used in the United States are sourced overseas. India now supplies about half of the generic drugs we consume, but 80% of the active pharmaceutical ingredients that make those drugs possible come from China. In fiscal year 2024, Chinese firms supplied 77% of India's penicillin G and 94% of its 6-APA, which is the indispensable intermediate for penicillin-derived antibiotics. This concentration creates a dangerous single point of failure for drugs that every hospital, clinic, and pharmacy in this country depend on. That means a Medicaid prescription filled in Ohio or a Medicare prescription processed in Florida can often be traced back to a Chinese supplier. The choke points for our most basic medicines are controlled by Beijing. And we are not just dependent, we are actively financing that dependency. In 2024, Medicaid reimbursed more than $150 million to a single generic drug company that sourced ingredients from at least 6 Chinese firms tied to forced labor and national security concerns. Dual-eligible patients, who represent just about 14% of Medicaid enrollment but consume more than a third of its spending, are the most exposed to this fragile system. Every taxpayer dollar spent on these medicines strengthens the leverage Beijing has over our healthcare system. The consequences for seniors and all American citizens cannot be ignored. As Chairman Scott mentioned, contaminated eye drops from India have left American seniors permanently blind. Blood pressure and diabetes medications imported from Asia have been recalled after testing positive for carcinogenic impurities. These are not outliers. Over 30% of recent FDA import alerts involve Chinese producers, and another 16% involve Indian suppliers. These are the very countries we rely on most. Even more troubling, our data shows that forced labor is woven into these pharmaceutical supply chains. Chinese state-owned enterprises with documented links to Uyghur forced labor in Xinjiang supply raw materials and active ingredients that ultimately find their way into drugs consumed by Americans. This creates both an economic competitiveness barrier through labor arbitrage and a quality hazard for U.S. pharmaceutical supply chains. The weakness in our medicine cabinet is also a weakness in our national security. More than 54% of the Department of War's pharmaceutical supply chain is classified as high or very high risk because of reliance on foreign suppliers. Chinese state media has openly suggested that drug exports could be withheld as a weapon in conflict. In that scenario, the most basic medicines in our hospitals, our pharmacies, our military stockpiles could become tools of coercion. No adversary needs to fire a shot if they can choke off our access to antibiotics or insulin. The path forward will not be simple, but it is clear. We must expand domestic production of critical medicines, particularly antibiotics and essential generics. We must diversify supply chains to trusted allies and ensure no federal program relies on a single country. We must enforce forced labor laws so that no American patient consumes medicine produced through coercion. And we must demand transparency at every level, using modern mapping and monitoring to stress test these supply chains before they fail. The stakes could not be higher. Every time a senior fills a prescription, every time a service member receives treatment, every time our children and grandchildren need to fight an ear infection, there is a real chance the supply chain leads back to a potentially compromised source. Thank you for your time this afternoon. I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
In your written testimony, you recommend the federal government conduct regular stress tests of the pharmaceutical supply chain to stimulate worst-case scenarios and identify weak points before failure. Can you speak a bit more about how the federal government could address identified weak points from these stress tests?
Absolutely, and thank you, Ranking Member Gillibrand. So two things. One, just to speak about what Dr. Pierre Vincenzi just mentioned, there are multiple ways to reduce the cost of these drugs as we reshore them. One of them is also relying on the innovation of our allies, right? I mean, there is a global market for pharmaceuticals, and as we start to look at that market, we do need to diversify both location, but also we need to diversify in platforms. And so if in many cases, there are multiple areas of the supply chain where we are advising our customers, which are the Fortune 500, we're advising our customers to find 2 or 3 suppliers downstream to purchase metals, to purchase chemicals, to purchase goods from. They can do 2 things at that point. They can, one, utilize their purchasing power to actually reduce the cost of the underlying chemicals, precursors, whatever it might be, key starting materials. 2, they can give back some of that. Our customers, when they do what's called a directed or embedded spend program, they typically save between 7 to 22% on landed cost on the end good. They can actually share back some of that to get to a resilient supply chain and to get to a supplier that's willing to agree to ethical quality standards. So these programs exist today. They exist in other industries. They're not as common in pharmaceutical supply chains, but there are pharma companies in Europe that we're working with today that are engaged in these activities, and they're doing it specifically to address CSDDD. To get to your second question, which is on these stress tests, we've been working across a number of different federal agencies, DLA, FDA, to map the 227 critical medicines within our supply chains, and to understand what are the consequences of whether it's disruption, like the hurricane, which knocked out our IV fluids capacity in the United States, or it's major shortages and wargaming due to conflicts with near-peer adversaries, or if it's due to significant changes in availability of underlying materials. When we're doing this analysis, it's simple supply chain planning. Companies do this all the time. Now, what we have to do is we have to work probably across a consortium with companies like Exiger and Pharmacopoeia to create a complete view of the supply chain. And that complete view of the supply chain doesn't stop at sort of the specialty pharma or the innovative pharma company or the generic pharma company and their suppliers. It has to go all the way down. And what we have to see is that reverberating impact. Because Dr. Pierre Vincenzi said it is true that many companies have 15 suppliers of the same product at that next tier. And then they have 4 suppliers at the next tier. And then it goes back to 1. And just no one knows it. That's what happened with ventilators during the COVID-19 pandemic. All of our solenoid valves went back to one company in Italy. And so even though Ford and GM and everybody stood up to make more ventilators, we couldn't truly make more because there was only one company that had that solenoid valve for the commodity ventilators. So we actually have to make sure that mapping is complete. And then we have to make sure that we're assessing all of the risks that can actually impact that environment, whether it's geopolitical, it's natural disasters, or it's material shortages.